Hello, all you amazing women, and welcome to How to Feel Like a Midlife Goddess. With me, Amanda Ryder, nutritionist and author. Now, I call this podcast How to Feel Like a Midlife Goddess because, let's face it, so many of us don't feel like shining in midlife. We can be grappling with physical and psychological symptoms, which can lead to a real loss of confidence, and it can feel like you're really losing your identity. However, I believe it's possible for us all to feel good at this time of our lives. So each week, I'm going to be sharing with you my best nutrition and lifestyle advice, as well as interviewing expert speakers. And week by week, together, we will build upon a foundation of healthy, sustainable habits that will really benefit us and make all the difference to how we feel. So stay tuned, because this is your recipe for thriving at midlife and bringing out your inner goddess. Hi everyone, I hope you've had a good couple of weeks, and welcome to this episode 5 of How to Feel Like a Midlife Goddess. Episode 5 already, that's exciting. So this week I wanted to tell you about my recent trip to Japan because it was absolutely fascinating, and I feel as midlife women we can learn an awful lot from our midlife counterparts in Japan who really don't suffer very much with menopause or worry too much about aging. So let me share that with you. So yeah, I just found Japan absolutely fascinating. It's so culturally different in so many ways, and I've wanted to go for the longest time because I'm just so interested in their diet and their culture. But it is a 14-hour flight, and it's a long way to go. And I was thinking, can I really make it work? Because it was quite a last minute decision. And I was thinking about work, and it's a lot of money, and it's a lot of time off work. And, husband will be on his own. He couldn't come. And then there's the dog. But you know what? I listened to my inner goddess, my inner midlife goddess, and she said, just go for it. And it was such an excellent decision, because it was such a brilliant and fascinating trip. And I met my son out there, who was sort of finishing his kind of year out trip, and my daughter came with me, and we just had the best time. Japan has just a wealth of knowledge, and their culture, like I said, is so interesting. And, let's not forget the Japanese are one of the longest lived nations on the planet. So I really wanted to learn what's so unique about their way of life. And why don't Japanese women suffer with the menopause like we do? And, how do they age so well? And it's just amazing because, Japan is just this island that's a bit bigger than the UK, in the Pacific Ocean. And yet, they do so much so right. And I just wanted to learn all about it. You absolutely love this if you're feeling a bit, kind of middle-aged, as, we sometimes can, you look in the mirror and you catch a wrinkle or a grey hair or something. And if you're not careful, you can go down that spiral of like, oh, it's all downhill from here on. So with that in mind, let me tell you about the word in Japanese that means sort of menopause age. And it's pronounced like this. 更年期年齢. And it basically means, roughly translates to your renewal years and energy. And they kind of see, going through menopause and getting older as a sort of second spring and a new beginning. And kind of that's what we all really want to have, isn't it? So in this episode, let me share what I've observed from my time there and hopefully give you some inspiration to take the best bits of the Japanese approach to health and well-being and understand what they eat and how they live such long and healthy lives, because we felt absolutely amazing whilst we were there and eating the Japanese diet. We felt light and energized and alive. And I want to pass on what I can so that maybe you can use some of these dietary principles in your own life. So it's well documented that Japanese women have very few issues with the transition through menopause and generally getting older. And, they have a low incidence of symptoms like hot flushes and night sweats, or they're certainly not reported. And they've only recently come up with a word for a hot flash, which is hoto furase. Excuse my pronunciation if you're Japanese, but that's the best I've got. Anyway, Yeah, they do seem like they're, the Japanese women are the poster women for menopause. They just seem to have it sus. So I'm quite interested, or I was interested to understand why that might be. So, well, let's first consider their diet. And, these are the headlines. The food is so healthy there. This is kind of what we observed. It's so healthy and unprocessed. They eat a lot of rice and tofu and fish and miso and more rice, and they repeat that quite a lot. Rice to them seems to be what bread is to us. There really isn't much bread around, and I think, rice is quite easily digested by most of us. They don't seem to fry as much. They do fry, but they just don't seem to fry as much. The food just seems, like I said, very unprocessed and quite clean. They embrace the proverb, Hari Hachi Bu, which just means eat until you're 80% full. And I must admit, whilst we were there, I was, perpetually hungry, but it would only last for like 20, 30 minutes and then it would pass. But I think the food was quite light and maybe not as calorific as the food we have here. They don't eat a lot of saturated fat, notice that. They enjoy their food very much so, and they kind of eat it more slowly because they, generally they are using chopsticks. Now, obviously, they eat lots of fish. It's an island. They really embrace, fish in all guises. And what I learned before I went, reading in my Lonely Planet book, was that the waters around Japan, they're very cold. And this apparently slows down the fish's metabolism, which reduces muscle breakdown, and that improves the quality of the flesh. And as a result, you kind of get firmer fish that is incredibly tender, even when cooked. And I can say that when we had sushi, even in the cheapest places, it was really, really high quality. So, maybe that's one of the reasons they eat a lot of fish, not just because of the health benefits, but just because it just tastes really, really good. Now, they do eat, beef and pork and chicken, but it seems to be more occasional, especially the beef and the pork. They eat a lot of soya products. Comes in, tofu, miso, tempeh, natto. I don't know if you've heard of any of these things. Tofu is just soya milk that's had coagulants like calcium added to it or magnesium salts. And I've even seen it made on YouTube with just like lemon juice. But basically what they do is, they add these coagulants to the milk and then you get the curd and the whey. And then what they do with the curd is they just sort of drain it and they kind of make it into, they press it down into blocks. So it's that simple. Very unprocessed, really. Now, tempeh is kind of similar, but they use the whole, instead of like the milk, they just use the whole bean. I find tempeh quite salty for my particular taste. And then miso is, and again, as I said, that really features highly in the Japanese diet. But that is, fermented sort of soya bean paste. And they add a stock called dashi stock, and it kind of gives this lovely umami flavour. That kind of really like Moorish, want to eat lots more salty, savoury kind of taste. So, soya really is a big star in the Japanese diet. Now, tofu is really good. I mean, I eat tofu maybe, 2 or 3 times a week, and, it's got quite good levels of calcium in it, anywhere between 100 and 350 milligrams, and we're looking for about 1200 milligrams a day. So, that's quite a good level. Depending on the type of tofu you have, there's different varieties, like silken tofu tends to have more water in it. And, I find silken tofu is brilliant in smoothies and making puddings. I sometimes melt some chocolate and add it some tofu and whiz it up and then put it in the fridge, and that is really makes a sort of delicious mousse. And then your firm tofu is better for stir frying, but it does need like soya sauce or tamari sauce or something to give it flavour, because it is quite bland, but it is a really good source, like I said, of calcium and also protein. Now, they eat a lot of fermented foods. And again, when you're eating your lunch there, you will always have some pickles or some fermented foods. And we know, that fermented foods are very good for your gut microbiome. They sort of, they feed the good bugs and make sure that you've got good diversity. And we know that if you've got good diverse microbiome, you're more likely to live longer and have less disease. There's obviously a lot of salt in their diet, with these fermented foods and pickles and things. And I just do wonder how they manage with, this high salt, because it doesn't seem to have a detrimental effects on their health. And like I said, they are one of the longest lived nations on the planet. And, normally, if you think about high salt in this country, we think about, it's associated with higher blood pressure, an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. However, there, it doesn't seem to be such a thing. And I wonder if it's just because there's a lot of focus on fresh and natural ingredients. So it offsets the salt. There's a lot of portion control. They don't eat huge amounts of one thing. There's very little processed food. And I noticed this when I I help people change their diet. Once they go from like a processed food diet, where if you look at processed foods, lots of salt added, and sometimes you can't always taste it. So once you start giving people just, natural foods that they're making at home, making themselves, that brings down the salt level quite a lot. So maybe it's just because they don't have processed food. And, salt, some people say, high levels of salt for certain individuals is quite a good thing. So, there is, it's not, salt isn't all bad. So a lot of pickles. The other thing we noticed is, sweet foods tend to be things like, fruit. They'll have fruit off, for dessert, or they'll have very small quantities of something sweet. And, if you can imagine like a quarter of a piece of cake, that's the kind of, portions we're talking about. Or they have things that are made of bean curd, and they are sweet, but they're a lot less sweet than we're used to. And it's nice to have something, but it's not really too sweet. So obviously they're not eating a lot of sugar. Number 6, they have savoury breakfast. So their breakfast can consist of like miso soup, some tofu or some grilled fish, some pickles, small amount of rice, maybe some rolled omelette, some nori, which is just, seaweed. So that does seem to be, a big staple for them. And their diet is very simple. They have this word called, and I'm pronouncing this really badly, but shoyin ryoro. And it basically means rule of 5. And, they look for 5 different colours and 5 different flavour groups, and just keep it really simple and delicious. So there's not a lot of, really rich, creamy laden sauces. Number 8, they do have fast food, but they don't generally eat on the go. And their fast food is, generally something like onigiri, which is rice, which has got some fish in the middle. And then it's kind of wrapped up in seaweed, like nori. And it's kind of made into like triangular shapes. And you can buy it in 7-Eleven, and it's really delicious. And, that's their kind of equivalent to a sandwich. Then they also have the bento boxes. And if you go on the bullet trains, as soon as you go through the barrier to get to the bullet trains, there's shops that sell these brilliant bento boxes. And the bento boxes, you'll typically find some carbs in the forms of rice or noodles. And then there'll be some protein, some fish or some meat or some rolled omelette, and an assortment of pickled and cooked vegetables. So you're kind of getting the idea of the sort of thing they eat. Letty, my daughter, she bought a bento box, and you pulled a string and it heated up the food. And we had that on one of the amazing bullet trains that, somehow didn't smell up the whole carriage. So, I have to say, if you get the chance to go, the bullet trains are absolutely amazing. They do sort of 200 to 300 kilometers per hour. So you can, traverse hundreds of kilometers in a few hours. And these trains, they're so immaculately clean. It's just such an amazing experience. Anyway, back to food. Now, they eat all is wonderful, simple, healthy, traditional, fresh food, but they wash it down with, copious amounts of green tea, and they do love a cup of matcha tea. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the difference between green tea and matcha tea in a short while. But just to go on that, and just to say that, like I said, our digestion really did feel fabulous, think flat tummies all round. And we kind of found lighter, felt lighter, more energized sort of altogether. And I was considering, well, why do we feel like this? And I think it's because the food is so fresh, like I said, minimally processed. But there is a lot of rice. And, we'll say here, a lot of rice, white rice will really spike your blood sugar. But I think because it's a small amount and, it is minimally processed rice, isn't it? Whereas if you're buying bread, it's got lots of other ingredients. Most people sort of will buy a loaf of bread in the supermarket. And if you look at the ingredient list, it can have 15, 20 different ingredients. So therefore, it's quite a processed food. And although rice is quite plain, they do add lots of flavours like soya sauce and pickles and teriyaki. And I think, that white rice can be quite calming to the gut, and rice noodles, and they do have wheat noodles as well in ramen. But I noticed they tend to eat their rice at the end of the meal. And if you've kind of listened to any of my podcasts when I did the Feel Good 4, I talk about eating in order, that if you eat your vegetables and your protein first, it has less of an impact on the spike of blood sugar. So your blood sugar is better controlled if you can do that. And they do tend to eat their carbohydrate at the end of the meal. So they are eating their rice and their vegetables and their protein first. So let's consider, a typical plate for them consists of a protein, which could be some raw salmon. We often had like grilled mackerel, and it would have some lovely seasoning on it, but it would be absolutely delicious. Tofu in various guises, sometimes, like I said, pork, chicken, beef. They have this amazing beef called Wagyu beef, and it's basically, Wagyu just means Japanese cattle, and it's a cattle that's native to Japan, and it's famous for its sort of marble texture, which means it's incredibly tender and has a sort of rich buttery flavour. And it also has high levels of omega-3 fatty acids, which we know are good for them. And these cattle are kept in small lots, and they have a very stress-free environment. And because of that, they burn less fat, and the meat is more marbled and tastes more delicious. And then, with this protein dish, they'll have another 2 or 3 side dishes, which basically, can be a miso soup, some vegetables, and some gohan, which is just the word for rice. They also really enjoy seaweed, and Japanese women, or Japanese in general, think that seaweed is really good for the skin because it's a humectant, and they really do look after their skin. And Japanese women, they're really hard to age because they have really beautiful, flawless skin, and I'll talk about skin and how they look after it a little bit later. But like I said, seaweed and its humectant qualities is part of that picture. And then they, again, they have pickled radishes, and there's this lovely radish side dish called okazu, which is, a umami-rich chili, miso, and sesame oil-based condiment. And I did look this up, and you can actually get that in this country. It's called Yukata, one of the brands that does it. And I bought one recently that is like radishes, and it's kind of in a little jar, and from the Yukata brand, and it's really, really delicious. And I'm just adding that to my dishes and sprucing them up a bit. But, it could also include fermented foods and maybe a little bit of natto. And natto is also a soya product, but it's kind of fermented. It's fermented with some bacteria, which I did make a note of, called Bacillus subtilis. And this is missing from a lot of our diets, and it's a soil-based organism that used to be in the soil quite a lot and quite prevalent, but with modern day farming, we don't find as much of it. So the Japanese have a little bit of this natto with their food, and when I say a little bit, I'm talking like a teaspoon. It doesn't taste particularly amazing, so you're literally, it doesn't taste amazing at all, it's horrible. It's got this really stringy, like, sort of consistency. But it's really good if you're having any sort of issues with your digestion. You might want to try it. You can get it in this country. And I've got a friend, and he's having a teaspoon of it every day with his breakfast. He's just kind of eating it and thinking, well, it's good for me. And it'll be interesting to see what his microbiome looks like after he's been having it for a few months. But you might want to look that up. And natto is just about N-A-T-T-O, but they eat it a lot. So fermented food obviously plays a big part in the Japanese diet. And then I mentioned earlier the green tea. They serve it in with most foods. And I just want to go back. I forgot to say actually that a lot of the foods they're eating, they're served in small bowls. So you'll have your protein in one bowl, and then you have a couple of vegetable dishes in another bowl, and your rice in another bowl, and your miso soup, and you kind of eat with chopsticks. So that's the kind of meal they have, and it's on lovely trays, and it all looks beautifully presented. And then of course they'll have some green tea with that. So let me tell you a little bit about the difference between green tea and matcha tea, and how this potentially helps midlife women, and the Japanese age so brilliantly. So green tea is you have the green leaves, they're grown, they're harvested, and then you have them in a tea bag or loose tea, and you steep those leaves in some hot water. They've got lots of polyphenols, and they, can taste really good. The trick with green tea is not to put really boiling water on it, because that can make the tea more astringent and more bitter. And I think that's where a lot of people go wrong, and then they think, I don't actually like green tea. So that's kind of how green tea is cultivated. Whereas matcha is that bright green tea that you sometimes see. And you do get it in some of the more fancy cafes in this country, in the UK. I haven't seen it in the US as much, but I'm sure it exists there too. But matcha tea it's green tea. But what they do for the last 3 weeks of the growing process, they cover the tea leaves. So they're basically growing in the shade. And then what this does, it means that the leaves or the plant has to work a lot harder because it's trying to, finish its growing season in shade. And in this way, it makes more chlorophyll, which gives the matcha tea its bright green colour. And it also makes more polyphenols. Now, polyphenols, they're a group of compounds that are found in plants, and they have a wide range of benefits to human health due to their antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. And most of us, we need more of these because we want to lower our risk of disease and some cancers and cardiovascular disease and heart disease. And it's even said they improve blood flow and they're brilliant for your gut health. So, most of us want to get more polyphenols into our diet. But of course, the Japanese, it just kind of happens really naturally. You can also find polyphenols, they're quite rich in dark berries, dark chocolate, cacao, if you like sort of the powdered raw cacao, apples, green tea, herbs like rosemary, find some in flaxseed, but matcha, has brilliant levels. So like I said, because the plant works that much harder, it's in the dark, the matcha tea, it has more polyphenols. So if you think also that the leaves of the green tea, they're all ground up together. So, with normal green tea, you're just steeping the leaves, but with the powder, you are using all the leaves, you're capturing all the nutrients and all the polyphenols. So when you drink that matcha tea, you're getting a much bigger hit of these polyphenols. Now, I would say if you're buying matcha tea in the UK or the US, you want to go for the best one that you can possibly afford, because the really good ones have a rich, sweet flavour and they're nice and frothy, they have a nice texture. Whereas the cheaper ones can taste really grassy. They have like these grassy undertones. So yeah, go for a good one. But hey, listen to me. I'm suddenly, after 2 weeks in Japan, an expert, connoisseur of green matcha tea, but I'm not. It's just that I've had both. I've had the cheaper stuff and I've had the more expensive stuff that I bought in Japan. And wow, a world of difference. So yeah, just remember it. So if you're making green tea, trick is, boil the water, put it in your cup, and just give it, a minute or two, because really, ideally, you want the temperature at about 180 degrees C for good green tea. So it's not too hot. It doesn't release too many of its tannins, and it's not too astringent. So yeah, green tea. And with matcha tea, you've got this powder, and you add, 1 or 2 teaspoons. You whisk it up. The Japanese, they use like a bamboo whisk, but I've just used a food processor or like my handheld whisk, and it's also worked really, really well. And I've just whisked it up to get all the powder, incorporated into like hot liquid. And then I've either added ice to that or some hot milk to make it into a latte. And it's absolutely delicious. So I'm kind of just swapping it out. I'm not having it every day, but I'm like having it like every other day because I do like coffee as well. But I just know by adding that in, I'm getting, lots of catechins and polyphenols. Catechins are polyphenols, but, I'm getting them in my diet. And the Japanese say that, that might increase your metabolism, your endurance. It can reduce your stress on the body, and make you less susceptible to illness. And it certainly seems to be working for them. So I'm going to give that a go. Matcha tea, obviously, like I said, has more of these polyphenols than green tea. And interestingly, green and matcha tea do have caffeine, but they have a lot less than coffee. And the other magical thing about green tea is that it contains an amino acid called L-theanine. And it does seem like, if I drink too many caffeinated drinks, I don't know about you, but I'm just like buzzing, and it's not a good feeling. It's like I want to, jump out of my body and run away. I could never have 2 or 3 coffees a day. It would just, I'm not one of those people that processes coffee or caffeine really, really quickly. However, with green tea, I can drink more. And it does seem like the Japanese, they really can drink a lot of green tea. And it's because it has, as I said, this amino acid called L-theanine, which is calming. And it's said that it can calm the brainwaves and it can also improve your learning and memory, and it's all down to that amino acid. Now, green tea has, smaller amounts of amino acids than matcha tea, which has, green tea has 3 milligrams and matcha has 45. So, it's a good idea, if you can, to try some matcha tea as well. And if you're thinking, how does it compare to coffee? Well, matcha tea is, obviously offset by this lovely amino acid L-theanine, which is calming. But coffee has about double the amount of the caffeine that matcha tea has anyway. So you still get a bit of a hit, but not as much if you are sensitive. So I keep coming back to this question. Why do, women over 40, 50, 60, 70, why don't they suffer with menopause, and why do they do so well? Well, researchers state that because their diet is minimally processed and has lots of fibre and very little damaged fats and healthy proteins, that's the reason that they think that they suffer less. And, they're eating a lot of fresh vegetables, and we know that a lot of fresh vegetables has an anti-inflammatory effect on us, really great for the gut, can improve, all sorts of symptoms. But, fresh vegetables, are really so healthy, as we all know. We don't need to be told that. But they also have, a lot of oily fish, these long chain omega-3 fatty acids, which most of us in the Western world don't have enough of. And we know that they improve blood flow and brain health. And the studies show that, again, people that eat oily fish 2 to 3 times a week are much healthier generally. A lot of this, a lot of soya, form of tofu, tempeh, miso, natto, edamame beans. You're really getting to understand soya now, aren't you? But soya contains isoflavones, and these are what are known as phytoestrogens. So they're like gentle plant estrogens. I mean, they're not an estrogen, but they're the sort of same shape as the estrogen that we make. And what they do in these naturally occurring compounds called phytoestrogens, they can sit on our own body's estrogen receptors. So if you're too high in estrogen, they can calm it down a bit, and if you're too low, they can sit on the receptors and give a very weak effect. But they're very weak, like I said, very weak plant estrogens, if you like, and they have like 1/1000th potency as a normal estrogen. But the Japanese eat a lot of these phytoestrogens, and perhaps this is the reason that they have lower risk of breast cancer and they don't have as many menopause symptoms. However, it's worth bearing in mind that in order for you to get these phytoestrogens and use them in your body, you need to break them down into a usable form called equol, and you need certain bacteria to do that. And in the UK, I read a study that said, only 30% of women have the particular bacteria that change the phytoestrogens into this usable form called equol. And, if 70% of us aren't doing it, then, that's not really going to help you, is it? But what I found is, when I'm trying to mimic a traditional diet like the Japanese, I try and do it in the way that they do it. And I eat the more traditional foods, like organic tofu, and it's been traditionally made. And what I've noticed personally and with my clients over the years is that when you start eating tofu, if you eat copious amounts of it, it can cause you a bit of indigestion. But with time, it does seem that people can start tolerating it much better. And I have to say now, I can eat a lot of tofu, and I think maybe I have the bacteria to produce equol, but I feel like it sits much more comfortably. And, I eat it more slowly, and I chew it thoroughly. But I do feel that, give it a go. Don't eat copious amounts on the first day, but just introduce it into your diet and see if it helps. But over time, people do start digesting it better. And you can get phytoestrogens from other foods like chickpeas and pulses in general, like lentils, beans. And me, I always think about, legumes for lunch is a good thing. The Japanese also do eat legumes. I didn't eat so many legumes when I was there, but, it does feature in their diet quite a lot. And things like fennel, are also rich in phytoestrogens. The other thing I would just say about Japanese women is some of the studies show that they don't have high levels of osteoporosis, this disease that we're really prone to after the age of 45, 50. And, it's when we start losing bone density. And again, I wonder if it's because they're getting the phytoestrogens. And even if they're not taking hormone replacement therapy, they're getting some of these weak plant-like estrogens, and that's helping keep their bones strong. I'm also thinking with, the wide variety of fermented foods that the Japanese women eat, that may also help their estrobolome. And you're probably wondering what an estrobolome is, but basically it's just a collection of bacteria in the gut which help you metabolize estrogen in the body. And we all need to sort of metabolize estrogen healthily and remove it from the body once we've used it. So it's really, really important that we do this efficiently. Because if we don't do it, it can lead to weight gain, low libido, low mood, just really will affect our estrogen levels, detrimentally. So, maybe these fermented foods, the diet, that's rich in vegetables and pickles and, sauerkraut and things like that can really help those bacteria that help you get rid of estrogen in a safe and efficient manner. Now, I sort of said before that one of the reasons that researchers think that the menopause women suffer less with menopause is that they have less damaged fats. And I didn't really elaborate on that, but, damaged fats are, sunflower oils and a lot of the commercial oils that we fry in, and we deep fry in those. And that does seem to be absent from the Japanese diet. And just think, those oils like sunflower oil, I'm just picking on that one, but any sort of seed oil, they are refined. It's not like olive oil where you press it and the oil comes out. It's a real process with seeds. It goes through a refinery and you end up with these oils, and there can be like solvents and things used in the whole process that aren't particularly helpful. So I would always advocate staying away from these damaged fats as much as you can. So yeah, loads there to think about for, your own personal diet. And I will go over like what we can do and what we can change practically while living in the UK. But I also want to talk about just there's so much, emphasis on health and well-being. I mean, everyone is into it. They even have a radio show. It's a sort of a radio broadcast that they have every morning, and it's like a 5-minute exercise routine. And they're taught this in schools, and older people listen to it. Everybody listens to it. It's designed to be accessible to everyone, and it makes the most of the body's momentum, so that it can sort of move naturally, and you get your lymph tissue moving, and it's all thinking you're kind of thinking of swinging arms like a pendulum and gentle star jump. So it's nothing too strenuous, but it's just like moving the body. And it's not, it's not at all like a boot camp. It's just this gentle way of waking up, moving your body, getting things going. And I wonder if that's also linked to longevity, especially in the older population, because we just know that if you sit around a lot, it can make you feel, quite lazy, can't it? And stiff. And if you're kind of moving about all the time, you can just get energy from that. Of course, with all these, with the older population that they have, there is a population crisis. There's too many old people in Japan and not enough young ones. So, yeah, that's a whole other conversation. It was quite interesting. Like when you're on the trains, you see, older people. I wouldn't know how old they are, but you can kind of tell the way they move their bodies. They're not, as young as they once were, but they're still going off to work. And I would have been really interested to ask them how old they were. But, people just carry on working in Japan. And I suppose that's good as well, isn't it? Having purpose and direction and a reason to get up every day. But anyway, just saying there's a lot of emphasis on looking after yourself, and everyone is doing it. It's not like a subsection of society. They're all into looking after themselves. Now, one other thing that they do, and we did, which is quite interesting, is to sit in an onsen. I don't know if you know what one of those is. I didn't until I went to Japan. But basically, it's like a natural hot spring, and it's very, very hot. And they do this sort of regular bathing. And you can get these sort of geothermically heated sort of underground pools that are sort of, they're heated by the sort of volcanic activity. There is a lot of activity, isn't there? A lot of tectonic plates that join in Japan. That's why they have a lot of earthquakes. But you get these beautiful natural hot springs, and they've got lots of beneficial minerals. And the Japanese really believe in sitting in these and relaxing. And We didn't go in any outside ones, unfortunately, but some of the hotels, they have these onsen pools in the hotel, and oh my God, they're so hot. I just couldn't sit in them, like 42-degree heat. It's like, oh my God, so hot. But they believe that it's really good for you, and that it promotes relaxation, it helps you absorb all these minerals, and it improves your metabolism. And I suppose for us, our equivalent is a sauna. And if you're into health, you'll know that saunas have been, there's been a lot of emphasis on looking at the Finnish study, which showed that, people that took regular saunas were much less likely to have heart attacks and cardiovascular disease. And of course, the Finnish take saunas very, very regularly. But, there is quite an emphasis on Japanese people. They work a lot, they're very disciplined, but they also really do relax. They also have these lifelong friends, which I'm quite interested in, called moas. These groups, they've known them for a long time, and they all kind of look after each other. And you see that in Japanese culture. It's not about the individual. They really think about, service to others and, what they can do for other people. And it's just really, really lovely. They're not overweight. And I suppose that's because of their healthy diet, and they move quite a lot. But Japan has one of the lowest levels of obesity in the world. I think it's something like 6%. I mean, I didn't see any overweight people while I was there. They're really, really skinny. I mean, they made me look, I'm quite skinny, to be honest, but, I felt like quite chunky. And they really are very, very slim. And yeah, I suppose there is just this discipline around what they eat, and it's this, lack of unprocessed food. And I'm not wanting to shame anyone. I think, if you're overweight in the West, it's really hard to lose weight. Once you get to a certain point, and it's very easily done with all this processed food. And a lot of us are really busy, and often food is the last thing you worry about, and you eat more processed foods. And I see a lot of people that are trying quite hard with their diet, but when I look at it, there's a lot of processed stuff in there, and it just doesn't, bodies just don't work so efficiently when they're having processed food, and people don't get the message that they're full, because the processed food can just override. If you put sugar and salt together, your brain just keeps wanting to eat it, and it can override all those sort of processes that we've evolved as human beings as knowing when we're full and sated. Sugar and salt can override all of that. So we can really struggle because we think that we're hungry still. And, that's why drugs like Ozempic are so useful and are working so well for people with obesity, because they turn off that message that you're hungry. But in Japan, they don't seem to have that. They really don't. And I don't know why, but I'm thinking about the bullet trains. I remember this train attendant on the bullet train, and she was absolutely stunning, as most of them were, and, wearing a suit, and, she looked like she could have walked into a boardroom and really kicked ass. But actually, she was on the train and checking tickets, and they just take a lot of pride in how they look. So obviously vanity plays a part in, how they live their lives. But yeah, she was so beautiful, and she would bow every time she went out of the carriage, as would the men as well. But they do take so much pride in everything that they do. Yeah, sorry, went off on a bit of a tangent there, but just remembering the lovely, beautiful train attendant. So, what can we kind of take away from all of this? What can we use in our own lives? And how can we, maybe think about our own eating patterns, lifestyle habits. And you know what? I'm thinking of doing a Japanese workshop, because my clients have been quite inspired by me over the last few weeks talking about all the lovely Japanese food. So I will keep you posted if you'd like to join me at some point, but I might start thinking about, how I can put one together. So these are really the things that I think that, you might want to consider doing. But number one, enjoy good quality soya-based products. Enjoy oily fish a couple of times a week. Number two, make miso soup, something that you enjoy with a meal, especially if you're one of those people, and I can be like this, I'll snaffle up all my food and then I'll think, I'm not full and I'm looking for something else. But I noticed when I was having miso soup with each meal, I did feel a bit fuller without feeling really heavy and full. Number three, try some matcha and green tea. Why not just swap out, some black tea, in the morning, maybe have a green tea instead of your black tea, and maybe have matcha tea a couple of times a week. Number 4, maybe get your pressure cooker out or your Instant Pot. I don't know if you know what an Instant Pot is, but an Instant Pot basically it's like a pressure cooker, and it's a slow cooker all in one. But I've been making rice in there, and I've been having a bit more rice sometimes instead of like sourdough bread. And again, I just feel really light and energized on that. But 5, maybe start getting into Japanese pickles and fermented foods. And if you look up, the Japanese pickles, there's quite a lot to choose from, and there are quite a lot in markets, and I'm sure there's loads in the US as well. But they really can, if you're having like grilled mackerel, some vegetables, some rice and some soup, and you have some of these lovely fermented pickles with them, it really, heightens the taste of the meal. Think about having some fruit for dessert, or if you are having dessert, just have a smaller piece. We had some people around this week, and we shared some cake, whilst we were watching the football on Wednesday, the Euro semi-finals. And, I cut one piece of cake into 4, and there were I had a few pieces, but we all just had a small amount. You don't need to have loads. Number 7, engage with your food, show gratitude. The Japanese, they always say, itadakimasu, which means I'll enjoy having this, rather than eating it really, really quickly. And number 8, maybe use some chopsticks, because that really slows you down. And it's quite a bit of fun. I've accumulated quite a few chopsticks in the back of my cupboard over the years, so I've been getting them out and using them, which is quite fun. And then number 9, they put a lot of emphasis on getting out in nature and, find peace and calm in nature, because I think that's another reason that Japanese women don't suffer so much with menopausal symptoms or, just getting older, but they have lower stress levels. And we know that getting out in nature, especially walking in forest, they have a name for it, Shirin-yoku, which just means forest bathing. And they've done studies on this, and they've shown that it lowers your stress levels, your cortisol levels, and your blood pressure, and it improves immunity. Apparently, tree leaves give off this volatile organic compound called phytoestrogens, and that helps. When we breathe that in, we produce more natural killer cells, so that can help our immunity and help fight off, disease. And it's just, a brilliant way of seeing how humans and, nature sort of live symbiotically. We kind of, can benefit each other, although I'm not quite sure how we're benefiting the trees at the moment. But yeah, getting out, walking in nature, in the forest can just bring you some peace and calm. And then number 10, think about, variety, diverse flavors of foods. And they really have they look at their diet, and when they're putting a meal together, they think 1 soup and 3 sides. And so you've got your miso soup, and then the 3 sides will be a protein and some vegetables and some pickles. So it's a really good way. And if you've read my book, it's the same sort of thing. I talk about having the feel-good 4 on your plate. But it's just a way of getting, like I said, your protein, your vegetables, your pickles, and some carbohydrates. So keep it simple. And, we don't need to load our food with heavy, creamy laden sauces, to make our food tasty. So yeah, loads there for you to think about. And me, I'm always want to share all and everything that I've learned. But just to say these are some of the things that I've personally changed. I'm keeping my foods a bit more simple. I'm busy at lunchtime. I just want to eat something healthy and get on with my day. And I don't know about you, but after cooking for a family for 27 years, I do get a bit sick of cooking, even though I know that you are what you eat. It's so important. Nutrition is right up there. So I'm trying to keep it really, really simple. Number 2, I've been starting a little morning routine, and I have a stretch and I move my body every morning for 5 minutes, because I don't always manage to get to the gym. And I found that's been really beneficial to how I feel. Number 3, I'm really appreciating nature and trying to get out in it as much as I can. And I do have a dog, so I have to walk her every day. So that's sort of forced upon me, which I am really enjoying, I must say. But I'm trying to make my garden as beautiful as possible. And if you go to Japan, they've got all these beautiful Japanese acers, the Japanese maple tree. And it's so, so beautiful. And they glide and float. And I'm, filling my garden with those. And it's just so lovely to get out and amongst those. I'm also chopping more vegetables than I need, so that I've got my fridge full of vegetables or salad that's ready to go. And the other thing, I haven't sort of talked that much about the skin, but they do really look after their skin. There's a lot of emphasis on beauty products, and they're really sort of well researched, and scientifically proven to work. I think the Japanese skincare is supposed to be one of the best in the world. And they put their SPF 50 on, and they also massage their moisturizers in their skin. And, there's a whole, women have this whole ritual of doing that every day. And I've taken that on board, and I'm really massaging the cream, my moisturizing cream, into my face. And they say that it improves circulation and lymphatic drainage. And it feels quite nice just, taking a bit more time and slowing down, putting on my serums and my moisturizers, trying to keep my skin as nice as possible. So if you are, so just some final thoughts really, remember that Konnichiwa, this word for sort of middle-aged menopause woman or whatever, is all about renewal and energy. And, don't let the sort of time marching on, thinking about getting older, don't let it seem like such a negative thing. Us midlife women, we have so much wisdom, as I'm always saying, whether we're in our 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, we've accumulated a wealth of wisdom. And let's look after ourselves so we can feel as good as we possibly can going forward. And just some final thoughts. If you are thinking yourself to go to Japan, I would recommend having an itinerary and going around and just exploring the amazing places. We went to Tokyo, then we went up to Kanazawa and over to Takayama in the Japanese Alps. We went to Fukui, we went to Kyoto. They were all so different. We, like I said, we went on amazing bullet trains. Everything's so clean and efficient. We ate amazing food. We even chanted with Zen Buddhist monks in this temple called Temple Ahiji, and oh my God, that was just such a mesmerizing experience that I shall never forget. They're a lovely, gentle people. They're peaceful. They're so respectful and lovely to be around. They're a very highly evolved nation. They've got wide spread values. I love this phrase, okache samade, which they say to you a lot, but thank you to you. They're inclusive. They're all about the community, and they're not at all sort of individualistic. Anyway, I hope there is something there that piques your interest, maybe a couple of things that you can change in your own life. Next week, I'm going to be talking to another nutritionist. She is all about gut health, so stay tuned for that one. But for now, that is all, and I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to find out more about my approach, you can find me and lots of my simple, nutritious recipes demonstrated on Instagram at Amanda Ryder Nutrition, and that's Ryder with a Y. Or you can visit my website, www.amandaryder.co.uk. Or if you like a copy of my book, Feel Good for Menopause, you can find that on Amazon. And of course, if you enjoyed this episode, I would really appreciate it if you could like, follow, or click the subscribe button. It will really help me grow the podcast and keep me going. So thank you. And of course, do get in touch. I'd always love to hear from you. So that leaves me to say I'm sending lots of love and light from my midlife goddess to yours. See you next week. Bye for now.